statistically, the Union and the Confederacy throughout the entire Civil War lost over 660,000 soldiers. That was more soldiers than any war that the United States fought before the Civil War and after the Civil War, up to the numbers that basically pushed it over that figure in the recent war of Iraq and in Afghanistan.
Come all you young rounders, and a story I'll tell of the promise of heaven and the warning of hell. Take heed where you ramble, or too soon you will go. Way up on the hillside where the new flowers grow.
My office du jour. I've got my exterior set up next to Pickwick Lake, and I am just north of the state line between Mississippi and Tennessee. I'm in Tennessee, of course, and I'm actually just around the bend from the location of the Battle of Shiloh, which I wanted to talk a little bit about today. But before I get to that, I don't want to get ahead of myself. I want to give a little bit of context. There were some very significant battles, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson in Kentucky, that forced Johnson to withdraw his troops back into Tennessee, which gave Grant an opportunity to push towards Corinth, which is just in Mississippi, about 22 miles south of where I am right now. And the significance of Corinth was it was a intersection of railroads, the Mobile and Ohio Railroad and the Memphis and Charleston Railroad. And that's a vital supply, not only a vital supply conduit to the south, but also able to move troops around as well. And when Johnson found out that Grant was on his way to Corinth, he intercepted him just around the bend from where I am right now. He intercepted him at Pittsburgh Landing, which the Battle of Shiloh is also known as the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing. And the first day was actually relatively successful for the Confederates, but it changed very, very quickly the second day. In fact, overall, about over 110,000 soldiers that fought in that two-day battle, about 65,000, a little over 65,000 for the Union, and just under 45,000 for the Confederacy. There were over 23,000 casualties, over 13,000 for the Union, and almost 11,000 for the Confederacy. That was the single most bloody battle on the continental United States up to that date. Now, it goes even further than that, because they not only were able to strategically take that location, and then ultimately, of course, they were able to take Corinth, which again gave them control of the railroads, but later they were actually able to move even further south, and there was nothing the Confederacy could do. They were able to move further south to Vicksburg and take Vicksburg, which effectively gave them control of the Mississippi River. And of course, you know the significance of the transportation ability on the Mississippi River. But it was also, because it was, like, for instance, the battle actually occurred on April 6th and 7th of 1862. And it was early in the war, relatively speaking. This battle occurred, of course, in 1862, relatively early. And it actually kind of reminded me of something that I told my students in class whenever we would talk about the Civil War. To begin the Civil War, the Battle of Bull Run, the first Battle of Bull Run, there ultimately was a second battle at Bull Run. There were people who actually got in their carts, grabbed picnic baskets, and rode out to the battle, sat up on a hill so that they could watch the entertainment for the day. It was a devastating rout for the Union Army that were basically running tail tucked back to Washington, D.C., along with all the people that were in those carts, and the roads were just jam-packed with soldiers and civilians trying to get back to D.C. to run away from the battle, which obviously was a significant victory for the Confederacy. It not only showed them that the war was not going to end quickly, but it wasn't going to be as pretty as they had expected as well. And this battle, the Battle of Pittsburgh Landing, was actually very significant in that way as well, because again, over 23,000 men lost their lives. Very significant. And I just wanted to touch on the significance of the location at which I'm currently camping, which again is just right around the bend from Pittsburgh Landing.
And I'll never go back up the hillside where the new flowers grow. Back up the hillside where the new flowers grow.
We are standing at Pittsburgh Landing on the Tennessee River. The Tennessee River vital in the operations for Union forces at this time in the war. They're utilizing this river to thrust deeper into Confederate territory than they have been the entire war. And this was made possible when Fort Henry, a Confederate fortification near the Kentucky border, fell to Union forces early in February 1862. And now the Union flotilla of over 100 vessels and 2 gunboats have pretty much complete control of the Tennessee River all the way down to Muscle Shoals, Alabama. Because of the heavy rains, the Tennessee River is over its banks, but Pittsburgh Landing remains above water because of its high bluffs, and the Union military decides to land their troops here and establish a base of operations. By April 6th of 1862, almost 38,000 men, all their equipage, artillery, their horse flesh have all landed here and established this big camp at Shiloh.
And I would like to reverence the fact that there were over 23,000 lives that were lost here. One very interesting fact, almost 30 years after the war, the farmers finally got so upset about this location with their hogs digging up the bodies of the dead who had not been exhumed and properly buried, finally came together and created what ultimately became this park, giving up some land, obviously.
Behind us is Shiloh Church. It came into being in the early 1850s. The original congregation had split from the Union Church just up the road, and they picked this spot to establish a new church for their congregation, named it Shiloh, or the Shiloh Meeting House. This congregation is still active today in a more modern structure on the same site. This congregation was pro-slavery, and that's one of the reasons they left the Union Church. There had been a divide in the early 1850s all over the country, and this church is just a little microcosm of what's going on in the United States. When the congregation could no longer stay together, they split and formed a separate church, and that's what Shiloh Church is.
It would be very difficult to make your way through these woods anyway, much less being fired upon, and there were several areas that were integral in this battle, and one of them is the Hornet's Nest, which I'm heading towards, referred to as the Hornet's Nest because of the sound of the bullets flying by and ricocheting off of the trees, and the constant bombardment of the artillery.
D.W. Reed was a member of the 12th Iowa, was wounded, was left on the field wounded the night of the 6th, and then repatriated on the 7th. D.W. Reed will become the first historian of the park and also one of its first superintendents, and he will write the first history of the Battle of Shiloh in the early 20th century. In this account of the fighting at Shiloh, D.W. Reed will refer to the Hornet's Nest as the most important part of this fight, and that pretty much has been handed down generation to generation. That is, of course, questionable. There's fighting along a 3-mile front and a lot of serious fighting all over this battlefield, but D.W. Reed was not there, so D.W. Reed did not write about that. He wrote about his experience in the war. So this has become such an iconic spot on this battlefield for that reason.
One of the great things about what they've done with this park is they have actually preserved this in a way that if you were to have experienced this on the days of the battle, with the exception of the fact that there was so much rain, and then of course that would make it much more muddy, much more difficult to traverse. You would have seen pretty much what it would have looked like at the time of the battle. Some of these headstones are commemorating where officers, primarily colonels and generals, were either injured or succumbed to their injuries in battle. When Johnston was shot, he actually continued to lead the charge even though he had been shot in his leg, and what, unbeknownst to him, even though there was pain, unbeknownst to him, he had severed an artery behind his knee, and continuing to lead the charge ultimately ended up bleeding out. This must be where Johnston fell. So Johnston was wounded and he fell at this area, destroying the morale, really, pretty much destroying the morale of the Confederate Army. Placing Beauregard in charge. P.T. Beauregard is actually the same commander, I believe he was a colonel at the time, when the attack on Fort Sumter, which began the Civil War. P.T. Beauregard was the commander of the artillery unit that was commissioned to attack. Once the Union finally got their act together and realized that this was a massive attack by the Confederacy rather than just skirmishes from patrols, were able to concentrate and demolish, for the most part, the Confederacy on the second day. So far we've driven over a very large area, and I can only imagine how difficult it would be to gather up the dead. So many of them suffered for days before they died. Many of the placards that are up are commemorating the encampments that were either overrun and abandoned the first day or through and into the second day. So you can actually see where most of the soldiers were bivouacked or camping, and of course how that changes with the dynamic nature of a battlefield. There were several Union gunboats on the Tennessee River that were actually firing into this area as well, and they had huge guns, 32-pounders, much larger than the 12-pounders and 16-pounders that we've seen. Well, that's it. I am back to the Visitor Center. The tour has ended. I hope that I was able to capture enough to make it worthwhile. And I am now going to head to Chattanooga.
Jumping from cliffs so high, trusting our wings to fly. Sometimes we're crashing down, but we get up and start from the ground. And I really wanna know, if I will ever figure out where the road goes. Even if I'm falling down, I will keep on searching for my highs. You can say I lost my mind, I will keep on holding my head high. Even if the sky is falling down, even if the sky is falling down, yeah. The sky is falling down.
All the best, always.
Wanna come down to the underground old school? Here's a shovel, can you dig it, fool? Can you dig it?